G'day and welcome to another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups, all things DIY mechanical. On this episode, once again, we're working on the Mini and I'm going to show you how to repack wheel bearings and adjust them. So before we get started, I just wanted to clear the air about the preconceived idea that mechanics are grease monkeys that are covered from head to toe in dirt. So maybe 20, 30 years ago, that was the case. But nowadays, we have the modern technology of using it, the added benefit of wearing gloves and being cautious. Now, the reason why we're a bit more cautious is because of the chemicals that we're using. Back in the day, they used to wash their hands with petrol and not really give a crap about what was going on. Nowadays, we like to protect ourselves a little bit more. Now, I've spent 16 and a half years working as a mechanic in the trade. I've worked for prestige dealers from Volkswagen and Audi all the way through to Ferrari, Lamborghini and Porsche. So over the years, it was drilled into me to make sure that we always used the correct methods to make sure that we weren't dirtying customers' cars. Now, being clean is just as important as doing the job right the first time. The last thing that you want to be doing is giving a customer their car back and finding greasy fingerprints all over their car. Now, let me ask you guys this. How many times have you been to a mechanic and they've done all this work on your car and the only thing that you've ever seen that they've changed is the service sticker that's located at the top of the dash? I bet almost every single one of you out there has had that exact same experience. The things that we do as a mechanic, you don't often necessarily see. Unless it's brakes or tyres or maybe a set of new wiper blades, you may not see the actual benefit of the parts that we've just replaced. For instance, if we change the engine oil, the oil filter, the spark plugs and the brake fluid, you're not going to go physically remove those parts and inspect them. So the only way that the customer is going to know what you've changed is by looking at the service sticker. Like I said before, being a clean mechanic is just as important as doing the job right the first time. So when you get into your car, if you've got dirty hands and you're just putting them all over the seats and everything, you may not worry about it right now. You go home, you get changed, you wear your favourite chinos, you take your missus or your boyfriend out for dinner and it gets all over your pants. Your pants then stained and ruined all because you didn't wash your hands. So what I'm getting at here is not all mechanics are the grease monkeys that we imagined 20 or 30 years ago working in pits under the ground. We are quite clean. Make sure that you protect not only yourself, but your customers and your friends to ensure that you have a nice clean car to give back to them. That way they are satisfied with the service and it also shows all about your personality. If you do the job right the first time, the customer's more likely to return or even your friend. So take it from me, have clean hands, try not to get dirty, wear gloves and clean up after yourself. Now let's get to it. The first step we want to be doing is jacking up the vehicle. Now, on my previous episode, I had a guy named Kyle ask, where do you jack up your car from and where do you place the jack stands? This is a very good question, so shout out to Kyle for asking. So the advice I'm going to be giving you is going to be very mini specific, but I'm going to use it as a generalization once I've explained how I'm going to jack up my car. The Mini doesn't have a conventional chassis like a standard car. Instead, it has a subframe at the front and at the rear of the car, and that's what gives it the rigidity. Now, what we're going to be doing is jacking up off the rear subframe just here, and then applying a jack stand along the flat along here to ensure the vehicle doesn't fall off the jack stand. For demonstration purposes, I've come outside to show you the sill panel in which you would normally jack up a conventional car from. So the sill panel is this part right here. When jacking up a vehicle off a sill panel, you want to try and ensure you place the jack as far down towards the end as you possibly can. That way, once you jack it up, you will still have ample room up this end to apply a jack stand. If there's not enough room to apply the jack stand, find another piece of steel like the chassis or a subframe to place the jack stand underneath. If you're ever unsure where to jack up a vehicle, consult your owner's manual or seek professional advice. Now that we've jacked up the vehicle, we're going to move the jack stands into position. So what we're going to do is move them down out underneath the subframe. That way it's going to give maximum support. By placing them in the same spot on either side, it's going to ensure the vehicle is nice and level once you let the vehicle down via the jack. Now, for those of you out there who don't know what this is what we call a trickle charger. This is connected to my battery, so this ensures that I keep the battery at 100% at all times when I'm not driving it. Because the vehicle's on historic rego, I only get to drive it maybe once a week if I'm lucky. So to ensure that the battery stays at 100% performance, I keep it on charge when I'm not driving it. It's time to grab the trusty Ryobi rattle gun and take the wheels off. Now that the wheel nuts are off, don't forget to put the tyre underneath the car in case the jack stand fails. Now, because of the limited room that I have in my garage, I'm just going to show you the right-hand side of the car. Once you've done one side, you just repeat the process on the other side. Now that we've removed the wheel, we're going to remove the 2-inch spacer. There's usually 2 screws that locate the drum to the hub, but I've taken those out for easier removal. So we're going to remove the drum next. Instead of facing it down, we're going to face it up. That way, if there's any brake dust build up on the inside of the drum, we're not going to spill it all over the garage floor. Next, we're going to remove this cap from here to get to the wheel bearing. Now, going back to what I was saying before about being clean, this is the time that we're going to be wearing some latex gloves. We're going to be dealing with wheel bearing grease and it's going to get absolutely everywhere. So this is the easiest, simplest and cheapest way to stay clean. Now, it may look like I'm about to go ham on this, but this is the correct way in which you need to do it. This, my friends, is the wrong hammer. We are mechanics, not carpenters. We need to use ball peen. Sadly, I don't have a ball peen at home to use. We're going to put a screwdriver in between the hub and the cap and then give it a tap with a hammer. That's going to start to separate it. Once it's in there, you're then going to turn it, go to the next side, give it another twist with a screwdriver, and as you turn the hub around, the cap will start to come off, and just slowly lever it until it releases, and off it comes. Once again, you're going to face this upwards. That way the grease that's in there is not going to go all over your garage floor. Now that we've removed the dust cap, there's a split pin here in which we're going to remove. Then we're going to take off the nut. Generally, I find the easiest way to remove these is to grab a pair of pliers and pull it up from the top. Sometimes you get lucky and it'll come straight out. Other times you've got to fight it a bit to be able to get it out. Now this one's being a bit of a pig, so you've got to fight it a little bit. And as you can see by the colour of the grease, it's not overly favourable to be doing this without gloves on. So you want to try and keep as clean as you possibly can, regardless if this is your car, your friend's or a customer's car. Got the split pin out. Now it's time to move on to removing the cap. Oh, this one doesn't have one. So all we're going to do is just grab this grease, remove as much as we can, and then we're going to remove the nut. Now from memory, this nut is a right-hand thread, which means lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. It's going to come off, turning it to the left. On the left-hand side of the car, it is the opposite, which is a left-handed thread. So it is the exact opposite of doing this. If you ever find yourself stuck and it's not moving, try going the other way, because chances are it could possibly be a left-handed thread. So this nut here is called a castellated nut, simply because it looks like a castle. This is what enables us to put a split pin through the center of the wheel hub and then go through the middle of the nut and prevent the nut coming loose. Now, as you can see, the color of the grease isn't overly great. It's a bit of a brown, darky color. This is a good indication that it's time to change the grease in the bearings. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can clean these bearings. The best way I find is just using a bit of brake and parts cleaner. I grab my trusty parts bucket, stick all the parts in there, and clean it up. Now, with the back of the bearing, you've got a dust seal which we need to remove to get the back bearing out. Once you take this seal out, you then need to replace it. Otherwise, if you don't, it'll leak and then grease goes all over your shoes, which then can result in brake failure. Now that we've got the rear brakes apart, it's a good idea to check the wheel cylinders, which is this bit here. Easiest way to tell if it's leaking fluid is to pull the boot back and see if any fluid comes out. If any fluid comes out, you know that shit needs replacing. So we check one side, that's nice and dry, which is excellent. Now we're going to check the other side and see what happens, if anything comes out. Oh, so that drip that just came out, that's brake fluid, which means the seal is leaking and it needs to be replaced. So while we're here, we're going to change those as well. Originally, I was going to take my hubs into work, pull the seals out and show you guys how to repack the wheel bearings. But I remembered at home, I've got Old Faithful here. Using a bench vise at home is probably one of the best investments you can ever buy. You only need to spend a couple $100 to get a decent one. So invest in one of these and it's worth its weight in gold. So all we're going to do is place the hub inside the vise and then we're going to remove the seal. All you want to be doing to remove the seal is sticking a small screwdriver in here, giving it a bit of a lever, and it'll come straight out. Once it's out, you then want to grab a rag and just make sure that you don't let it touch your toolbox or any components around there, otherwise it's going to get quite dirty. Once it's out, the bearing will then slide straight out of there and then we can clean it. Having a heap of spare rags at home is certainly a great investment to have. So all we want to be doing is cleaning out the hub with all the old wheel bearing grease so we can start again nice and fresh. Now it doesn't need to be amazingly clean, but you want to try and remove as much of the old grease as you possibly can. Now another good investment to have is grab yourself a tub of grease. Now you don't need to buy the largest tub available, but given that I'm a mechanic, we usually tend to use it quite a lot. So I've got a tub of high temp bearing grease made by Castrol. This is something that we want to be using. Now there's different types of grease. We're going to be using high temp bearing grease. This is going to be exactly for the application that we're going to be using it for, which is for wheel bearings. They're going to get hot. We want something that's going to be able to handle the heat. So all we're going to do to repack the wheel bearing, we're going to grab a dollop of grease, just like this. We're going to stick it on our hand, and then we're going to work the bearing into the grease. Now this is probably the old school method you could do, but it's the one that I prefer to do. You can buy tools that will pack the grease for you, but I much prefer to do it by hand. So all we're going to be doing is getting the bearing. I'll try and show you this as best I can. And we're just going to be working the bearing into the grease, or shall I say working the grease into the bearing. So all you're doing is just pushing down on the grease and then sliding back, working your way through. As the grease starts to come through, you will then see it come out through the top of the rollers. Once it's then started to come through, which you can probably see there compared to the other side, that's when you know you need to turn the bearing. Once all the grease has come through the top of the bearing, you then move on to the next one. In this case, all we're going to be doing is pushing the grease all the way through. Once it's all the way through, we're then going to apply a thin film around the outside, put a little bit more in the hub, and then reassemble it. Now the bearing setup on this is a tapered roller bearing, which is generally what you'll find on a trailer. So if you have something similar to this, you should be doing it at least every 12 months or every service, especially if you're using your trailer to tow your boat down to the boat ramp. You should do this as often as possible to ensure the longevity of the bearings. Now you don't need a lot of grease to do this, just a small handful is fine, because then you can always add more grease. So the bearing size is quite small, so it's not going to take a lot of grease, but we want to make sure that we push all of the old grease out. A good way to know that if your wheel bearings need to be repacked is to look at the condition of the grease and also check any free play. Now what I mean by free play is you want to be grabbing the wheel on either side and giving it a slight rock. If there's any sort of movement side to side or even up and down, it's likely that your wheel bearings need to be re-greased or they need to be adjusted. But in saying that though, if your car has several ball joint setups at the top or at the bottom, or even it could be the front axle, which is your steering wheels, you might find that the tie rod or tie rod end ball joint might be worn. So we'll cover that in another video on how to check to see if you need to replace your wheel bearings, do an adjustment, or check and see if there's any free play in any other ball joints or control arms. Now once you're satisfied the grease has come all the way through, I generally give it a bit of a wipe, grab some new grease and smear it around the outside. That way it's nice and covered. Now with grease, you can never really go too ham with it. And by that, I mean you can never have enough, except if you spill it on your brakes and then it's contaminated. So you just want to apply it liberally. That way it's going to be nice and greased by the time you put it in, and there's going to be ample grease to do its job. Now, if there's any dirty grease left over, make sure you wipe it on a clean rag and dispose of it when you're done. That way you're not putting the old grease back into the new grease tub that you just bought. So once we're satisfied with one, it's on to the next. Now the cool thing about buying these parts from Carcraft is the part number that's on this box is the exact number that they used from the late 50s all the way up until the early 2000s. Now in 2001, BMW bought out Mini. So you can buy a brand new Mini that's this year, 20 years old, that has all the gizmos and gadgets of the latest technology cars. So it'll have airbags, power steering, fuel injection, the lot. Whereas my Mini clearly has next to none of that. Now I buy most of my parts from Carcraft, so if you're in the New South Wales, Sydney area, by any means, hit them up and see what they have to offer. They're very competitive prices and they're very quick in terms of shipping as well. So we're going to put that aside now that we've got our wheel cylinder, and we're going to install that afterwards. So the next thing we're going to do is grab one of our hub seals and we're going to install it. So you just want to be careful when you apply the seal. There's two different ways that this could potentially go, but there's only one in which it actually goes. So if you have a look here on the front, it's got a nice flat surface. And then on the back, if we turn it over, it's got what we call a garter ring all around the inside. That's what keeps tension on the seal. And the reason for this is that's what actually causes the seal to seal against the hub. So we're going to face it with the garter spring facing inwards and the flat side facing out. Or in this case, the flat side is going to go towards the fuel tank. So the seal is going to go directly in there. All we're going to do is grab the biggest hammer you can find. Just kidding, don't actually grab the biggest hammer you can find because you'll come back with a sledgehammer. And we're just going to give it a nice easy tap all the way around. Make sure it goes in nice and even. Okay, so just be careful when you're pushing the seal in, that way you're not going to damage it. And then once you're satisfied it's all the way home, you can then put your hammer down so you're not going to go ham on it. And then we're done one side. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go over to the car and we're going to replace the wheel cylinder. So now that we're at the rear wheel hub for the wheel cylinder we're going to replace, we're going to grab a bit of our pump bottle brake cleaner and we're going to give it a bit of a clean. Now you don't need to use a pump bottle for this, I just have one hanging around and I prefer to use this style. You can just use the aerosol can, which is completely fine. Once we've given it a good soaking, it's going to dry fairly quickly because of the high alcohol content, and then we can get into removing and replacing the wheel cylinder. So to install the wheel cylinder is going to be quite easy. We have our bleed nipple down here, which I'll take off. We need to take our brake pipe off down from the bottom, and then hopefully, without removing any of the shoe assembly or the springs, we should be able to get it out from there. If not, then we just cross that bridge when you come to it. So I ended up finding my 1/4 inch ratchet, which is probably the longest 1/4 inch ratchet you've ever seen in your life. So once again, we're just going to be re-bleeding the brakes. We're going to just have to take it off, allow it to drip, take out the nipple to begin with, and then we take the line off and hopefully we can pull out the wheel cylinder without doing any further modification. Just make sure that when you're performing this, you ensure that you keep an eye on your brake fluid level. The last thing you want to do is allow it to become too low and then suck air into the system. So we're just going to loosen off the line, slowly work it out. Once it's loose enough to undo by hand, we will then undo it. Okay, so once it's loosened by hand, we can then just pull the line straight out. Just want to make sure that you don't bend it too much. So now that the wheel cylinder is loose, all we're going to do is just pull the shoes back a little bit, and hopefully be able to wiggle it out without too much trouble. There we go. Just leave it dripping in there, otherwise it's not going to go everywhere. This one's got a gasket as well between the edge of the wheel cylinder and the backing plate. So we're just going to make sure that lines up, which I'll need to take this nipple off as well before we install it. Okay, so just going to go straight back on there. Just line up the shoes with the wheel cylinder and then slide it back on once it decides to line up. And sometimes what can happen is the handbrake comes out a little bit, but that's all right. We can just manipulate it to where we want it. Line it up in the hole. So the next thing we're going to do is just put the pipe back in and then tighten it up. That way you can get on to bleeding the brakes. So once we've tightened up the nipple, she'll be then ready to reassemble. And don't forget to wash that down with brake cleaner as well when you're done. That way you're not going to spread any brake fluid anywhere else. Now before we reassemble, all we want to do is get a little bit of our wheel bearing grease, and we're going to put some on the shaft just here. That way it's got ample grease when it goes back on, making sure that you don't touch any of the brake shoes on the outside. Otherwise, contaminated brake shoes with grease is not going to be fun for when you brake. You're then going to grab your hub, slide it straight on, and push it until it stops. And then we're going to get our bearing. Now remember, we have the nut to go on the end of the bearing. Now we don't want to be applying the nut to the bearing, otherwise we're going to crush it. We have the spacer washer, which I've already cleaned. That's going to go on next, followed by the nut. As you can see, well, you might not be able to, but if you look closer, you can see the witness mark where the nut's been rubbing. The wash will only go one way, so that's the way we want to have it. Screw the nut on there. I'm going to tighten it up in a minute. Also, inside the little dust cap, we have a section full of grease. We're going to pull that out and we're going to replace it with fresh new grease. That way, any movement that gets inside there, the grease can move around and lubricate the inside of the bearing. As you can probably see by the color of this, it's not overly favorable to be having in there. So whenever you repack your wheel bearings, you want to make sure that you renew the grease that's in the dust cap at the top. That way, everything is nice and clean and fresh. And if someone else pulls it apart in the near future, they can see that you've changed it. Now, you don't need to put a lot of grease in there. I generally just do about that much. Once you put it in there, it will squish out everywhere. So you don't want to have too much, otherwise the little relief valve, which is at the top, it'll start pushing out grease. We want to finish tightening the nut by hand until it doesn't go any further. Then we're going to use a spanner or a socket to tighten it up. Now, you're probably wondering, why the hell am I using a shifter and not a socket or a spanner? Simply because this fits perfectly between the wheel studs here. So all we want to do to adjust it is just nip it up by hand. We're going to come around to the other side. And this is the trick that I was showing when I was an apprentice. So we're going to loosen it off. We're going to drop the spanner, let it fall, and then give it a little bit of a push. Now, we're not going to be able to tell the amount of free play that's in the wheel bearing like this, because the amount of movement we're going to have here is significantly less than what we have all the way out here when we put the wheel on. So all we're going to do is just grab the wheel, do up 2 nuts by hand, and then see if there's any movement. We just get the drum, make sure that we line up the holes just in here, refit the drum till it stops. Next, we're going to grab the wheel spacer, put that on. And remember, we're only dummy fitting it, so it doesn't matter too much yet about the bolts that go through and locate the drum. So we're just going to do up 2 of these by hand. That way they're not too tight. And we'll just have a bit of a feel for the wheel bearing. Take it back off, and then we can readjust it if need be. Because my son is asleep, we're going to set it to setting number 1. That way it's going to be nice and quiet, and I'm not going to wake him up. Okay, so all we're going to do to check wheel bearing play is just grab the wheel, move it side to side, see if there's any movement, and then we're going to go up and down. So there's a little bit of movement there. We can probably just add a little bit more tension to it. So this will just be a case of removing and refitting several times to make sure that we get it right. So I'm just going to give it a little bit more. Put the wheel nuts back on and we can retest it. All right, there we go, nice and firm, up and down, side to side. There's no movement whatsoever. So now all we got to do is pull it back apart, retension everything, put the dust cap back on, tighten up the wheel nuts, and then we're done. Next thing I'm going to do is install a brand new split pin. That will just slide straight through and come out the other side. And then we're going to give it a bit of a twist. So you're just going to grab the end, bend one side over, spin it straight over. Next thing we're going to do is grab a dust cap. Now that it's full of grease, we're just going to put it on. We're going to grab a hammer and lightly tap it on. Now you can see grease is flying out of there, which is fine, just means it's just the excess we've put in. So anything that is too much will just come straight out, and that's fine. Make sure you give it a wipe. Once it's all the way home, it'll then keep spitting grease until everything comes out. So we're just going to grab the drum now. We're going to make sure we line up the holes and we get some bolts and we'll stick them through. Push it on all the way home. Grab one of the bolts that we took out from the other side and we're going to install that. Now all this does is just help locate the drum. It doesn't actually hold it on. What holds it on is the force of the wheel. So now that that's pretty much slowed down, wipe that off, get rid of my rag. I'm going to grab the wheel spacer, slide it on. Last thing we're going to do is just grab the wheel, I'm going to refit it.
Now, if you have a rattle gun, all you need to do is just do up the wheel bolts a couple of turns. The rattle gun's going to do the rest. Make sure you always start them by hand first, never start it solely with the rattle gun. I'm going to grab the Ryobi rattle gun, we're going to set it to setting number 2, that way it's not going to go ham, it's not going to wake up my son. Always remember that when you're tightening up wheels, you always want to do the one that's opposite after you finish doing the one that you've just done. If it's a 5 or 6 stud, you can either do a star or you can just do the opposite wheel nuts you've just done up. Always make sure you use a torque wrench. I'm going to bring it down once I finish the other side and then torque it up.
Shout out to the guys at Mighty Car Mods. Along with this episode is proudly brought to you and sponsored by Penrith City Tyres and Automotive, all of your on and off-road needs. Until next time, guys, enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you next time on an episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups, all things DIY and mechanical. Bye.